Let's get into our first topic now. And should we decriminalise drugs for personal use? Get your calls in for this now. The Scottish Government wants Westminster to change the laws and allow people found with drugs on them to be treated and supported rather than criminalised and excluded. Scotland has the highest drug death rate recorded by any country in Europe, and ministers believe that a law change could improve and save lives. In response, though, Rishi Sunak's spokesperson has said that the Prime Minister has no plans to alter his tough stance on drug laws. But should he, Tessa?
Yeah, that's a great shame. Our Wickhamist Prime Minister, perhaps slightly out of touch, which is with what's going on in the, for instance, underbelly of Glasgow. I, like you, Storm, grew up in Scotland, and historically, really since the 70s onwards, there have been a disproportionate number of what they call deaths of despair, and those are suicide, alcohol and drug-related deaths. But just let's own those statistics. Over 1,300 deaths a year. That's about 4 people a day dying of drug misuse. This is an epidemic. This is a tragedy. And to be fair to the Scottish Government, and I'm a massive critic of what the SNP have done to Scotland, but they have made drug deaths a priority. They've taken this on board as a public health mission. But there is only so far they can go as long as we, Great Britain, and we have to own what's going on in Scotland, as long as we are lumbering under a drug act that's over 50 years old. It's almost as old as you, Ali.
Well, Tessa, let me ask you this. How on earth is this actually going to break the supply chains of drugs? I mean, you're decriminalising drugs, you're treating it as a public health issue. This is what the Scottish Government wants to do. How on earth is that going to do anything to mitigate the supply of drugs? The answer is it's going to do absolutely zero, zilch.
It's not actually, interestingly, about the supply of drugs. What decriminalisation would allow, and it's not a silver bullet, you need a raft of other measures to come in alongside the decriminalisation, but you would be able to have overdose protection centres where people could inject and at the same time be monitored to make sure they're doing it safely. There was an unsanctioned centre in Glasgow in 2021 in which there were no deaths, but this was a low threshold area where people could come up in contact with services who ultimately, in the long term, want to help them. And just on a really basic level, if you are a long-term, highly problematic drug user, there's all sorts of other safety aspects that you might need help with. For instance, one of the guys using just had 3 wheels on his 4-wheel wheelchair, and it had been like that for years. So just on a sort of basic humanitarian level, this is a way of getting people on the right side of the track.
Are you in favour, this is in Scotland, they're doing this, are you in favour of decriminalisation of all drugs across the country?
Well, if you look at where it's been most successful, for example, it was introduced total decriminalisation, not just cannabis, in Portugal in 2001. And with a raft of other measures, these centres massively reduced deaths from drugs, and it reduced our HIV.
Okay, so Tessa, tell me this. Tessa, tell me this. Why should a middle-class cocaine user who's snorting cocaine off their worktop at a party in Notting Hill at the weekend be decriminalised? I mean, that's an utter disgrace. These people are actually fueling an international trade that blights people's lives, that costs people's lives in this country through county lines, gangs, warfare, including deaths.
I'll come up with a reason for that. Perhaps it's to free up police time. So instead of going after the users, they're going after the vendors, the ones that are selling it and causing this industry.
Well, someone who called into my show the other day was talking about actually a very interesting idea, which is, forget about decriminalisation. Why don't you just do this? Why don't you just say anyone caught in possession of any drugs of any kind are going to have their passport taken away, their driver licence taken away, and they're going to be publicly shamed on a website.
Because if you're addicted, that's not going to...
Yeah, but I'm talking about a lot of middle-class people who are not addicted.
Yeah, but you're
this is a recreational drug
health,
users.
But potentially punishing those that have a real health issue.
Yeah, but some do and some don't.
Let's call this
some do and some don't.
You're not potentially... You're killing people. This
Tessa,
law means more people are dying.
But you're not making a distinction between people who are genuinely suffering because they are addicted because of very many issues that may be facing. They may be facing abuse, long history of drug addiction, and people who go to parties at the weekend or festivals who want to actually take drugs from ketamine to MDMA to LSD to loads of other things to cocaine. Why on earth would we decriminalise this to actually give tacit approval to that kind of behaviour?
Because All the studies show, Vancouver is another great example,
yes,
that actually in monitored, safe environments, it saves lives. 60,000. I am answering your question.
Yeah, I'm talking about the middle-class drug user.
Because do you know what
who has cocaine at a party?
I worked in a drug centre in Peckham 20 years ago, and one of the guys in our care, there were 12 people, and by the way, if you want to reduce the numbers of people in prisons, if you want to actually properly deal with the criminal underbelly in this country, the best way to go about it is to start looking at the drug laws. In my time there, and I only worked there for 6 months, a lad died. He overdosed. It was an unnecessary, tragic death. These deaths, the problem is that they don't have a vote, that they come from the underbelly of society. They don't have a voice. And people like you, with your middle-class muscle, gets everyone listening terribly worried that their little Samantha or Johnny might take cocaine because of a change in the drug law. You're putting in the fear factor into
Sorry, Tessa, I'm not putting in a fear factor at all.
You are.
No, I'm not.
By the way, Tiddles and Samantha and Johnny take cocaine anyway.
Can I just make a statement here, which is that only in the last few weeks there has been a massive outcry amongst festival organisers for dance music festivals. You know, I'm a DJ. I DJed at many different events around the world. And I can tell you this, the government wants to introduce licences for drug testing on site. I think that that's also wrong, because that's, again, a tacit admission that we are basically decriminalising drugs in this country.
Let's go to the phone lines now. Christine from Hampshire, this has been really interesting so far. What's your take on this? Do we decriminalise drugs for personal use?
No, we don't, Storm. No, I don't agree with this at all. If you smoke now, you're a leper, aren't you? I mean, in fact, I think when Labour come in, they want to ban smoking full stop. And yet they want to legalise drugs. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's absolutely ridiculous. And at least cigarettes only affect you physically, with lung cancer, heart, that sort of thing. I mean, as an ex-smoker myself, I know. But drugs are mind-altering, aren't they? I mean, it's bad enough having to take drugs for medical reasons, for depression and what have you. And
there is a huge amount, can I just stop in there? There is a huge amount of debate going as to the impact that other drugs have on a person compared to alcohol and cigarettes. And a lot of this research and a lot of these studies actually suggest that long-term use of cigarettes and alcohol have far more impact than one-off uses of some of these drugs.
Yeah.
So, but you're right when you say, actually, if we were given the chance now, would we legalise cigarettes? Potentially not. However, if this saves lives, Christine, debunks any sort of mystery around drugs, then maybe it's the right thing to do.
No, to be honest, Storm, I know I'm going to sound hard, but we need more deterrence in this country against crime. We're far too soft on crime. If we really came down heavy on people, the awful people who supply drugs, then we could stop it that way. We've got to be hard on them. Got to be hard.
One of the ways, there's a cocktail of drugs that kill so many users. 4.8 times as many people dying at the moment in Scotland proportionally than England. And one of those drugs is actually, we know it as Valium. And there was a loophole where prescription Valium was being peddled on the streets and that was being used and mixed, etc. And there was a spike in the death rates after that loophole was closed and the equivalent of Valium that was prescribed was no longer available, and therefore users were having to use any old rookie concoction. So there is a lot to suggest, that's just one example, one anecdotal example, that actually if your drugs come from prescribed sources, they are less fatal, less dangerous for the most vulnerable.
What you're discussing there is actually just legalising drugs in general, just legalising.
If you legalise something, you can then control it.
You can also tax it, but you may also encourage the uptake of it.
You see,
no, we have to be strong on this and say no. We have to have some standards. We mustn't be frightened of saying no, this isn't right.
Okay, Christine.
Are you with me?
Christine, I wonder, can you imagine 4 people a day dying north of the border? That is an epidemic.
Care. I don't actually care. There are more people are dying of other things. It's their own fault. I'm sorry. They choose to take drugs.
No,
Christine, do you see it as a health issue though? Can you recognise that actually somebody taking drugs is an addict the same way an alcoholic is an addict?
No, I don't.
But Christine, can I just really quickly, there's a huge amount of research that says actually a lot of drug users, their parents were drug users. Often these people, they lost their parents through drug use. A lot of these people grew up in care. There's a direct link between extreme poverty and drug use. I don't think we can toss such individuals to one side as a society, as a civilised society, can we?
Christine, thank you very much for your call. I think Christine thinks that we can. John from Shropshire, what's your thoughts on this?
Well, I last week saw something very, very distressing, literally 5 minutes from my door. I went down some steps to get to the train station and I was met with 5 drug users, literally one with a needle in their arm, which I found so upsetting and very dangerous. And yet only 5 minutes walk from this is called a place called the Ark, which is a support for drug users and alcoholics. But legally, they're not allowed to go there and get safe help to have their drugs, you know what I mean?
But
and it's sad that this is happening.
John, if we listen to Christine's argument, though, you know, our earlier caller, we need to just get tough on drugs, and unfortunately, that's the way it has to be. So we don't encourage people to take it.
We haven't got the money and the resources. She doesn't know what she's speaking about because we can't police every single city, every single town. We have to be adult about this.
John, let me ask you a question. So I understand your point you're making, and it must have been extremely, of course, distressing. So if we decriminalise drug use in Scotland, which is what they want to do, how on earth is that actually helping people in the long term, other than taking their drugs in a safe environment and decent quality drugs, which is what Tessa's advocating, which I think is utterly ridiculous, by the way. What are we doing to actually break the supply of drugs in the first place? The answer is nothing.
I disagree with you. Amsterdam, they don't have a massive drug problem and it's decriminalised there.
Yeah, it's a different issue, right?
No,
so we're talking about, you either legalise drugs, which is different from decriminalising personal use. It's a total different thing.
John, what we could see is what you experienced was 5 drug users taking drugs in public. And if you decriminalise personal use, what you might see is an increase in that sort of activity because it wouldn't be illegal.
I disagree. I'm sorry. I think that we have to look at it adults.
What this show's for is to disagree, John, so you don't need to apologise.
But John's saying they could basically go to safe spaces to go and do it, right?
Yeah, but they may not.
It's going to do nothing to stop the supply of drugs by county lines drugs gangs that are blighting people's lives, including young people who are getting shot and killed as part of those gangs.
But I think the point, John, that incredibly powerful illustration of the men grouped at the bottom of the stairs, there is no choice there. Those men don't have agency. They're pitiful addicts. They are not going to choose to take more drugs because it's no longer criminal. But what it does mean is we can help them legally. We can put them in safe spaces where we can get them on the road to recovery.
Tessa, look, I understand your point about safe spaces, but what you haven't come back to me on is a point I'm persistently making, that yes, in certain parts of Scotland, there may be the case that it's people who are suffering,
and parts of Wales.
And parts of England and parts of Wales, but there are a plethora of middle-class drug users out there that are not suffering from abuse, that have not been in care, that are having perfectly nice lives, that are using recreational drugs at the weekend to get kicks. Right. And that is absolutely
And they're doing it already, aren't they? They're doing it already.
And they should stop.
OK,
Right.
I want to go back to the phone lines. We'll go to Esther from Ayrshire. What's your thoughts on this?
Morning, guys. I don't say this proudly, but I just phoned up because I just feel I've got a wee bit of skin in the game here. I live in Scotland. Sorry, I've got a really sore throat at the moment. I used to be a drug addict, and all I can say is had somebody said to me, if Decriminalise it or even one of those places you can go to get, I would have took more. I think the best way for a drug addict to get off drugs is to deal with the reason why you take the drugs. I just don't see. I don't see any other way how you get free. No, it was a long journey for me, and I thank God that I'm sorry you're talking to you clean today. But I just I would have. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, no, not at all. First of all, congratulations. That's an amazing achievement. What do you mind me asking? What kind of drug it was that you took? That you were...
I will say this, I went straight to heroin, and here's the reason. I had a lot of rejection issues, and so I knew I just wanted to numb myself just enough. I just smoked out just enough, and I held down a job for 4 years. I was a functioning addict, and it was only till the job came to an end, and then obviously I needed money, and that's where things...
So, Esther, as a functioning addict, I think that's very difficult, probably one of the most difficult really situations to deal with, because as a functioning addict you tend to hide it very well. But I wonder whether we actually have to put some common sense to this and handle different situations differently. So maybe we need to look at the kind of drugs that we would decriminalise for personal use. Maybe things like heroin, injecting heroin. I don't know whether you could legalise the difference between smoking heroin and... Don't know enough detail about that, Esther, if I'm being honest. And say cocaine for party use for the people, the middle class cocaine users that you think that we need to really sort of clamp down on. I wonder whether we need to look at it in more detail, Esther, and whether that would help.
I mean, I do agree with you. I mean, I don't know what the silver bullet is, but all I know is that unless you deal with why you take drugs, you're never going to be free.
And one of the ways of getting help and getting access to all the drug services that are available, that only 40% of users in Scotland are actually facilitating, is through these centres. And that's why it's absolutely paramount that we revisit a 50-year-old law.
Sylvia from County Antrim, what's your thoughts on this? Do we decriminalise personal drug use? We're not talking about decriminalising drugs in general.
No.
But if somebody is taking drugs, there is a risk that they are addicts, and that would be a health issue, right? They should be helped rather than punished.
To drugs. I lost my son. And I absolutely do not want them decriminalised.
Yes, I mean, it's very hard. You're obviously going to be really passionate about this yourself. Do you mind me asking what it was your son was taking?
It was an E. He never got the heroin. He started off in cannabis. And cannabis is the one thing
gateway
that
drug.
leads to everything else. So
and it was an ecstasy tablet that took his life?
It was an ecstasy, yes.
See, this is the problem, is when we we're looking at all drugs with the same view, Tessa, isn't it? Is actually, in that situation, we don't really want young men and women or any age to be taking ecstasy.
But the problem is, if you listen to...
He started at school at 13. I'm sorry, I have to interrupt here. He got outside the school. He didn't come from a family of drink, alcohol or anything.
No, we're not accusing you of that, Sylvia, at all, and our sympathies are massively with you, and it's a really interesting point to interject into the debate, so thank you for your call.
I'm so sorry, Sylvia. I can't imagine losing a child, so I really feel for you. My worry is that the whole debate becomes injected with fear, and what we don't do is listen to the professionals on the ground, and almost with one voice in Scotland, they say we need to visit as part of a package of solutions to save lives.
One of the main problems is heroin,
like perhaps.
But one of the predominant problems is heroin. So maybe we need to focus on heroin rather than ecstasy or cocaine.
You can't do that unless you revisit the law, which is what the Scottish government's asking.
You're talking about the professionals, right?
Yeah.
Professionals have a particular view. You're hearing from Sylvia here, who sadly lost her son to ecstasy, right? And had a gateway drug, which was marijuana.
Right.
Now,
while, by the way, all drugs are illegal.
Okay.
In a country where all drugs are illegal, that happened.
Fine. So she's got that view. You heard the previous caller as well, who was also a previous drug user who's now clean, saying this would not be something that she would advocate at all. If you decriminalise it, it would lead to more use, not less use. You're focusing on the professionals. I'm focusing on the people who've had personal experience, who are coming out and saying this.
So you're going on emotional anecdote.
No, I'm not.
And you're deriding expert opinion.
No,
it's okay, that's what Rishi Sunak's government does. So it's okay to do that.
Sorry, Tessa, you're not going to get away with that. Look, basically, the point is this. If you're going to make an argument here, people do, that alcohol and smoking is terrible and worse than drugs, I'm saying that we shouldn't live in a society where two wrongs make a right. The fact that we've got alcohol and smoking allowed, which kills so many thousands of people in this country every year, is not a justification for making things worse on the drugs front.
There's also nothing to say that you can punish somebody for having personal use possession of drugs, as well as help them. So you punish them as well as put them in rehab, as well as offer rehabilitation in prison or whatever.
But how do you access them? if they are not coming forward as users, if they're off grid, how do you access them? If they're dying at a rate of 4 a day, it's a death rate in Scotland. It is an outlier, Scotland. It's the highest in Europe.
So maybe we need to look at more localised laws, maybe just specifically to Glasgow, maybe Aberdeen. I don't know what other cities have particular problems.
Until
or maybe we need to look at particular drugs, different laws for different drugs. I don't know. Thank goodness I'm not going to be the one that's making up these laws. But Sylvia, I am so sorry for your loss. And thank you for all your calls. And our sympathies go out to anybody that's lost any loved ones in those sort of situations and circumstances.